this is already out on Figshare. You can see that link in the bottom. And I just want to sort of walk through how this sort of came about just before I go into this. And it was really just about, I think it's, I don't know the term, but the equivalent of a citizen scientist. You might have a citizen sociologist, I'm not quite sure. So this isn't my day job. This is just something that I've come along the way, and I've managed to get some success. And I've tried to re-engineer how I got that success. And this was this idea of this capability maturity model. And, you know, it's kind of like an iceberg. So the actual model is like one slide, but there's like 40 slides in here that actually explain things at this, you know, leading up to that to make the capability model make sense. And then there's some things that I've used to help visualize things a little bit more. Oops. So I just wanted to talk about this. This was sort of done a little bit while ago, but and the first time I gave this talk, I cried 6 times giving this talk. I did it at a conference in 2019. It was twice before I gave the talk, twice during the talk, which was kind of embarrassing because it was like a physical thing, and then twice after. And I haven't cried today, which is good. But it's actually this sort of stuff, it takes an emotional toll. So I wanted to sort of have a trigger warning. The idea that this is only for a few of you in the audience sort of diminishes now the fact that we have quite an intimate crew here and everyone's sort of self-selecting to be here. So that's probably not as critical here, but it sort of also explains that comes along with the trigger warning. What's my warrant for doing this? What's my motivation for doing this? The actual capability maturity model. And then this other thing that I've done to help try and visualize intersectionality and to talk about meritocracy, merit, you know, are we hiring on merit? And then lastly, how you might be able to help. So when I wrote the original document, and I'll explain that a little bit later, it was actually really, really difficult. And so when you're going through the questions, if you could be gentle with me, that's fine. If you completely disagree with some of the things in here, I apologize that you're probably going to be very bored for the next 30 or 40 minutes. And but I don't have the ability to engage. So so if you do that, that's fine, but please keep it to yourself. And the reason I want to talk about why I'm so sensitive is that people don't understand, but the events viewed have a cumulative impact. And they're not in isolation for marginalized groups. They're the straw that broke the camel's back. And so every time you get exposed to something, it's just a trigger for all the other things that have happened. And there's this, you know, research that's talking about cumulative exposure to racial discrimination has long-term effects on mental health in the United Kingdom, but I think that's more widely applicable. So when you look at, ooh, this is very sensitive. I'm going to try and move my mouse without doing it. So when you see when I get triggered when I'm dealing with this, and why I'm so sensitive is that I'll be triggered and I'll have this kind of intensity in terms of my emotional state. But to someone who has privilege or who might not know about all of this other stuff, I haven't been exposed to that stuff, it looks like I'd be overacting and it's only, it should be like looking like this. And I think for me, this is actually like a very dodgy visualization, but it actually sort of shows that the way that people get triggered can sort of lead to different things. And this idea of accumulating comes up again and again in this presentation. So this is what we were talking about, you know, this presentation isn't for everyone, but, you know, I guess the idea is to put it out there, and for anyone who wanted to ask some valid questions, I'm happy to be able to go through that process. Originally, when this presentation was given, it was given to a sort of like a room audience with of some of my peers, and so I was very, very careful about just highlighting this going forward. Not so much when I don't know you all, and you know it's virtual. Ooh. So what's my warrant for doing this? What's my motivation? So for me, there's still systemic imbalance and lack of diversity in the workforce. And this leads to a lack of opportunity for people from marginalized groups. And for me, that needs to be fixed systematically, and especially in senior management roles. I was in a university previously where you could clearly see it, and they clearly knew that there was an issue, but they didn't know how to fix it, or they didn't seem to have that motivation to fix it, but they at least acknowledged it, which was surprising for me. And there's also this large conceptual gap between what I see as diversity researchers and advocates and what I see in typical corporate diversity training. And because there's that gap there, I just wanted to be able to, I felt there was a need for a tool to help aid communication around this topic to try and bridge that gap. That's how this all started. And when I talk about systemic imbalance, this is the cartoon picture illustration that I think just clarifies it for me, where when you have a systemic imbalance and if you try and treat people equally from now on, you're assuming that they have the same opportunities, resources, and rights, and that's really not the case. When it's systemic, even if you're neutral, in situations of injustice, you've chosen this side of the oppressor. And so this is where this idea of this capability maturity model, and you'll sort of see how that sort of progressed when I show you the model. So, how do you go from, if you're just going to be neutral, you're not going to change things at a systemic level. And we all know about overt or blatant sexism and racism. And this is actually really common in Australian society. And this is an example here, but I think we've all had I would have normally put something down for an American audience, but I think everyone's sort of had it's been pretty plain to see in the last 4 years to go through that. So I thought I would keep it sort of Australian to be able to show that, hey, look, it's happening sort of everywhere. So this is easy to call out, but what actually happens is that when it's subtle and systemic discrimination, it actually accumulates this lack of opportunities. And I love this illustration because it's showing us like, well, actually, I'm going to measure you on how fast you finish the race, when you're not actually taking into account the degree of difficulty. And it should be noted here that when you talk about intersectionality, where I define it as having more than one attribute that is marginalized, it increases the degree of difficulty that it takes you to run this race. And so again, if you're coming from a neutral point of view and you're seeing this, you're going, right, I'm just going to measure the time it takes, not the actual degree of difficulty, not taking that into account. And it was really kind of interesting because for me, I can handle overt racism much more easily than I can handle subtle racism. And I guess this was, I found this research that was talking about, the effects of subtle discrimination were at least as bad as, if not worse than, overt discrimination. And it can actually have not so subtle effects on employees and their performance of work. So I was in a meeting once and someone said something that was so subtle that I just got triggered. I had to leave the meeting and I was sort of, I wasn't able to do anything else except sort of try and decompress and disconnect from that situation so I could go about and do my work. And if this is happening again and again and again, that all of that starts to accumulate. So what does that lack of opportunity look like? Gaslighting, when you're talking about where someone's saying that you're doing a bad job, that even though you're doing a good job, and this is an example here where he was denying the evidence that this lady was working there full on, and just saying, and just sort of dismissing and saying, oh no, that wasn't useful. That can be really, really tricky. And I've had to go through the situation a couple of times now where it's a nasty thing to be able to go through. And the tricky thing with gaslighting, it's very difficult for someone external to that relationship and that dynamic to know that it's actually happening. one of the big things is being held to a different standard. I say US version because I had an Australian version, and this was sort of done before all the things that had happened in the US since June, July from last year. But again, when you're looking at these being held to a different standard, what you're really asking here is, when someone does something, do we punish them or do we forgive them? And it's a really great way of being able to work out if you're being held to a different standard. And this goes back to this idea of, if you're not paying attention to these things, if you don't understand that these things are happening, it's very easy to be, to sort of be able to sort of push that back to the, off to the side and say, oh, it couldn't have been that bad or anything else like that. But again, when you're carrying an AR-15 rifle, which is dangerous, and you're being forgiven for doing that versus being killed pretty much straight away because you have a replica gun, you can see the difference between forgiving and punishing, if that makes sense. This is an example of where a name can actually allow you to be held to a different standard. And it starts early, and because it's cumulative. So every time they have this situation, as you're going through your life, if you belong to one of these marginalized groups, you just get taking these hits along the way. And so this is an example, just another example of that. This was a really surprising one when you talk about women and families, where this particular lady never had kids, but was still punished for it. She'd lost that opportunity. And again, the question becomes, over her career, how many times would she have been knocked back when someone didn't say it to their face, that she didn't have an opportunity to be able to show what she could do? So again, time and time again, when you talk about intersectionality, it's about, if you belong to multiple marginalized groups, you're getting hits from all directions. It's not just because you're a woman, it may be because you've got other things as well. You're a part of multiple marginalized groups. And so again, it's this idea is that over your career, you're going to get more and more, you're going to miss out on more opportunities than if you weren't a part of these multiple marginalized groups. Low expectations. You can't study chemistry. A well-meaning teacher, right? But she's now studying things on her way to becoming a doctor. And I just want to sort of highlight in there as well is that in this article, the teacher was treated very generously, right? When we were talking about punishing versus forgiving, this teacher was forgiven for what they had done. And so this is where you start to build up this pattern recognition when you see these things. And it's sort of one of those things that if you see it, you can't unsee it. And again, so if Angela had this in a well-meaning teacher, think of all the other well-meaning people along her career path who will not give her that expectation because of some reason or another. Even looking for housing can affect your work. So again, instead of Hassan being able to apply for the rental and be able to get the rental just sort of stood there vacant, even though he felt that he could afford it and everything else like that. And they know that that's what's going to happen. And so every time he's driving to work, he has to think about, right, instead of me trying to improve my career, I need to think about how I can work around this situation where I just need to be able to rent a house for my family. And again, it's a missed opportunity. So it's not just one thing, it's just accumulating these things all the way through. You can even be erased altogether. So Associated Press actually cropped out Vanessa from their picture. I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say. But again, if you can do it that blatantly, imagine all the subtle things that Vanessa might have to deal with throughout her career, and the opportunities that she might not be able to get compared to, say, someone who might be with a less marginalized thing. So you can sort of see that these are over things here, and I'm only just touching on a few things here, but high HR is like the score you need to get into university in Australia, or for one particular state of Australia. And this idea that ATAR is not a fair measure of their talent and capacity to success at university, because they may not have had the opportunity that other people would have had. So you can see there's this common element that I've been talking about. And so how I visualize that is lack of opportunities over time reduces employability. So when we talk about merit, when we talk about hiring on merit, if we're not taking into account these sort of things, I'll be really hiring on merit. And that's particularly interesting for me from a senior management and hiring into senior management, because that's when you're actually you can really see the stark differences in those lack of opportunities and the skills and experience that shows in there. So, like I said before, I've gone through all of this stuff, but the capability maturity model is actually like one slide. And this is the slide, and I just wanted to focus on the red thing in here, but let me talk about the level 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 is when your organization encourages the lack of diversity, or they just don't care. There's no real central question being asked. It's just whatever. If you just happen to be lucky enough to find someone who gets it, then that's fine. But if it's not, then you're on your own. Level 2, which is where I think a lot of organizations are, or the majority, or even organizations that are trying to change a lot of the hiring they might still be in, is this level 2, where a system that is neutral, which actually means it's keeping the status quo of a lack of diversity. So there's an understanding of blatant issues in diversity, but not systemic issues. And their central question is, how do we stop judging people based on stereotypes and unconscious bias and only judge on skills and experience? So when I talk about my experience in hiring and working with students, I feel like I've had to go to level 3 of this capability maturity model, where individuals are actively fighting the status quo of the diversity. And there is an understanding of the blatant, subtle issues in diversity. And it's more about how do we get people with privilege to stand aside to allow people from marginalized groups into more prominent roles and opportunities, or if you want to turn around the other way, how do we get more opportunities to people who've missed out? So I'm really talking about moving from an organization going from level 2 to level 3. Because if you're going from level 3 to level 4, then you've already you're just trying to systematize what you're doing on level 3. I like frameworks. So if you're wondering why did you decide to do that, I just like frameworks, which just happens to be a table, but it's everything around it that actually allows people to make good decisions, I think, going forward. So again, the big thing for me is the key is to give people from marginalized groups more opportunities to make up for the lost opportunities. If you have to try, if you don't go to the heart of this principle, everything that you do will be fragmented. If you try and do things, if you try and, I think there's a thing like, if you try and increase the pipeline, that people will get lost because they'll miss out on opportunities as they go through. If you try and just do it at a really superficial level, this won't happen. And so you'll be doing diversity and inclusion things for the next 10 years, and you'll find that you're probably slightly better or even the same as you were 10 years ago because you're not getting to the heart of this issue. That's my opinion. But when you move into CMM level 3, when you're getting people who currently had privilege, and privilege is usually, I've never had to experience this before, so I don't understand it, to sacrifice the power to allow people from marginalized groups into more prominent roles and opportunities, you can expect to get pushback. So on the International Women's Day, it's really horrible thing that this was said. The Australian Prime Minister, who's the top politician in Australia, Scott Morrison, said this on International Women's Day. We want to see women rise, but not at the expense of others. But that's the only, you can't do that. The reason that you can't see women rise in Australia is because of this privilege that men have, where they don't have to go through the same types or the intensive types of the lack of opportunities. So you're always going to get pushback on these things. And the other thing that's really important to understand is that you will feel uncomfortable. I've been doing this for like 4 or 5 years. I've been trying to do this, and I still feel uncomfortable because my position isn't as such that I can make those decisions unilaterally. I need to be able to justify it to someone. And so it's always really tough to be able to feel uncomfortable from my side, but I can understand that it'd be really uncomfortable people with privilege, right? So again, equality comes from people either sacrificing their privilege or having it forcibly taken away from them. And when you start to look into some of the things that have happened in the past, I think when you look at Martin Luther King's approval ratings before he died and when he was actually active, they were awful. People, they were really, really awful. And then after has happened, there's been sort of this thing, oh, look, you know, he was lovely and we want to try and be like, there's a huge difference there. And if you follow Martin Luther King's son or daughter, I think on Twitter, they sort of mention this again and again. You know, you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's not one of those things that you can say, oh, I feel comfortable. There are things that it's working. It's more than likely you're not doing anything at a depth that will promote change. And the key thing here as well is that it's easy to get diffusion or deny or delay tactics to be able to do things. And so Frederick Douglass in the 1850s talking about slavery, but, you know, they were saying, hey, Frederick, you know, you're a little too fierce on the slavery question. I'm sure that, you know, if you say it more nicely, it will make it easier for us to change. And that's not the case, because change is difficult and change is going to make you feel uncomfortable. And this is what people use to deny and diffuse and delay. And you can see that on social media and in print media and in some of the media, you can see that in the Black Lives Matter, they were using this sort of tactic to be able to say, oh, look, you can't do it this way, you have to do it the right way. But there is no right way. There's only an uncomfortable way, in my opinion. So one of the things that I also wanted to talk about was, you know, how do I sort of quantify this? And so I came up with this idea of a merit model percentage to talk about merit. And that sort of led to this idea about visualizing what that might look like. So it was because of this particular picture, I really wanted to get them to think about how can we think about that degree of difficulty when we're looking at hiring people or you know, helping people along. And so I created this model. And the risk is that this could dehumanize, but I think at this point, the reward is worth more than the risk. And this was actually, like I said, sort of triggered by this idea, this particular image. And so I just want to be really, really clear about this. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So this model is definitely wrong. And but it might be useful for you to help clarify your thoughts about how you might want to help going forward. So it's definitely wrong, definitely wrong. So the idea I had around the merit model percentage was your skills and experience. If I really want to hire someone on merit, I'd have their skills and experience. I'd divide it by the number of opportunities they had, and then I'd multiply it by the degree of difficulty. And so I arbitrarily picked where a degree of difficulty as being an exponential, so 2 to the power of something. And I chose number of marginalized groups that you might belong to. But I also realized for First Nations people and for certain areas, you might have highly marginalized groups. So I said, if you're a part of a highly marginalized group, you'd go 3 to the power of the number of marginalized groups you belong to. And just keep it simple. I'd say, well, your skills and experience are limited to ordinals 1, 2, and 3, where 3 is the highest and 1 is the lowest, and the same with your opportunities. So again, you know, this model is wrong, but it might be useful. So I wanted to give an example of Nova Paris, who's quite famous here in Australia. And you'll see in the examples that when I tried to work through it, it's difficult to choose the opportunities because we don't really know what opportunities these people have had. And so to give you an idea, so Nova Paris was the first First Nations person to win an Olympic gold medal. one of the very first people to represent the country at Olympic level in 2 distinct sports. She's the only Australian athlete to win Olympic gold in one sport and Commonwealth Games gold in another. So Commonwealth Games is for all the people who were colonies of Britain. So it's a cut down version of the Olympics pretty much. And she was the first First Nations woman elected to federal parliament in Australia. And so when I calculate her things, like if I'm choosing her skills and experience, she's done fantastically well. So it's like 3 out of 3. Opportunities, I can't really tell. So maybe 1 or 2, it's variable. But the degree of difficulty, she's First Nations person. So she's one of the one of the most highly marginalized groups in the world. And she's also a woman. So she's part of 2 marginalized groups. So 3 to the power of 2 equals 9. So her merit model percentage range is like from 1350 to 2700, roughly. To give a benchmark, I could only ever maintain a maximum of 600%, given that my degree of difficulty is 2 to the power of 1 equals 2. So I would rate myself in range of 200 to 300%, if you know what I mean. So when I see someone like Nova, I just go, wow, that's amazing what she's done, given her degree of difficulty, right? I can acknowledge that she's done well, but I can actually add a weighting there as well. And so when we're recruiting and we only look at that skills and experience here, and we don't take into account this and this, I don't think that we're really hiring on merit. And when you're getting into a senior position, especially in a senior position, this becomes even more difficult. So what I wanted to do is I just wanted to focus on the degree of difficulties and try to visualize this in a crude graph. And I call it the intersectionality spectrum, just because I wanted to give it a name. And I realized as I was doing this is that it's very contextual. And I've done this in Australian context, and at least to give you a bit of a feel, but it allows me to, again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I find it useful to allow me to see where I sit and who I should help, if that makes sense. So if you have a look here, this is the degree of difficulty. I'm sitting here as a male person of color, so I'm actually quite privileged. And as I go through and I'm looking through here, I can see that everyone to the right of me has less privilege than I do. Now, they might have different opportunities and everything else like that, but my question then becomes to myself is, how do I help people on the right-hand side? The right-hand side of where I am. But again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is definitely wrong. But when you start to think about this as triage in a hospital's emergency department, right? A person who arrives first is not necessarily the person who's looked after first. And the order in which a patient is seen is based on the severity of the need and how much they can help them. And the greater the need, the earlier they are seen and the more they're helped, in theory. And so when you're looking at this intersectional spectrum, I was thinking about, how would you treat this like as a triage in a hospital's emergency department? Now, what I think is what we're currently doing in Australia is we're providing a lot of help around this sort of side, and we're not providing a lot of help around this sort of side, and you see it again and again and again. Whereas what I really think we should be doing, these arrows look terrible, by the way, but what we should be doing is we should be putting more help into people over this side and less help as people coming through. It's not to say that people over here don't need help. It's just that the weighting means that we know that we're in a unbalanced society. How do we make sure that we can cover for it? So how can you help? So there are official ways that you can challenge the systemic nature of things. In Victoria and Australia, there's a special measure under the Equal Opportunity Act that says that in special circumstances, you can not hire in a neutral manner. You can hire for specific marginalized groups. But I really wanted to focus more on the everyday things that you can do to provide more opportunities, which includes going out of your way to encourage people from marginalized groups, identify talented people, and use ways that you can use your privilege to step aside for people from marginalized groups. And so, for example, this seems a little bit out of date at the moment, but there's a situation where instead of applying for a choice position, being able to encourage, mentor, and help people from a marginalized group apply for that position based on the weighting, when you, the WEIGHTING, the weighting of how you might fit in terms of the degree of difficulty. And for me, this isn't tokenism if they have the talent and potential and you're willing to share your skills and experience with to get them up to speed. And I'll give an example about that a little bit later. So again, if you move it too much and you say, okay, I'm just going to hire this person, it becomes tokenism. And even the people who are getting hired feel very, very uncomfortable. And again, I'll explain that a little bit later. Encouraging people from marginalized groups, right? So being able to interview marginalized groups by default and provide them with constructive feedback and how they can improve and highlight their strengths can be really helpful. Being able to go out of your way to introduce and mentor people from marginalized groups to try and make up for those opportunities they might have lost. This is a really big thing that for me is like when you see a marginalized person do something well, take the time to encourage them. This can really help with the effects of gaslighting. So I had a situation where I sent off a report. I got a really negative feedback from my supervisor at the time. And 3 hours later, I got an email back from the client saying, this is fantastic. Can you please keep doing this? And all of a sudden, it just made me feel, it was still a bad situation, but I didn't feel, it helped the situation immensely. I can't explain how helpful that email was. And also to be able to encourage them to build a support network from their own marginalized group who can support them now in the future as well. That can also be important as well. I've got a story about that, but I don't think I have time to talk about that one. Identifying talented people from marginalized groups. So when we're talking about, focusing less on skills and experience and more on potential and talent, and taking into account the degree of difficulty that I showed about before with that visualization, being proactive in job opportunities. So if you're getting to the point where you're going, right, we're just about to hand out the position description and advertise this, and you don't have people who you think might be valuable who are part of those marginalized groups, you might have left it too late, and you'll probably get less diversity in your applications than you would if you're more proactive. And this idea of the more marginalized a candidate, the more the gap between skills and experience should be reduced as a weighting compared to others when hiring. And this goes back to this idea of if you're hiring on skills and experience and you're at that capability maturity model level 2, and you're trying to be neutral, you're not going to be able to change anything. And a personal thing for me, taking into account extenuating circumstances, for example, returning from long-term maternity leave when doing things like skills tests. I did this in a previous one and I regret it because I realized that that wasn't an accurate reflection of how well they could do things and how well they could do things in the future, how fast they could learn. And to make up for that, I tried to make that up by trying to provide more opportunities and feedback. But still, I would have preferred if I had taken into account extenuating circumstances. So some real life examples, because I could have just been making all this stuff up, right? So there's this thing called the Research Software Engineering Community, and it was an international committee, and we were trying to select a committee via election. I actually read the capability maturity model for this to argue we should use a collaborative framework instead of, and that people are privileged to step aside. And I actually had a friend who went from wanting to apply as the chair to supporting a candidate who had a higher degree of difficulty than himself. And he was a diversity advocate. When I explained it to him using this capability maturity, he went, "Oh, yeah, I didn't realize that. That's great. I'm gonna support this particular candidate." Now that candidate had reservations because they didn't want to be like the token person there. And I actually had to explain to them that this is to make up for the opportunities that you've lost before this time. And it's to help you make up for the opportunities that you're going to miss out on later. And it's going to try and help you push through those barriers. I think you've got the skill set to be able to do it. You may not have had the skills and experience. Other people would have had more skills and experience, but those people with skills and experience like myself will help support you. The end result was that for a community that was overwhelmingly male, 91%, we selected 2 very capable co-chairs, both women, with one being a woman of color. it's the easiest thing in the world. It's also the most difficult thing in the world because it took about 6 months of discussion and trying to explain things, even after the capability maturity model, to get things to a point where we could try that, but it worked. When I was doing student internships in a research environment, even though I've come from a corporate background, so I said research/corporate, I organically built a very diverse software engineering team that at one point consisted of 4 women and myself, 3 students, and 3 of them were women of color. To give you a benchmark, I had a friend in the similar industry who wanted a diverse team and who was really keen on diversity inclusion, but this person struggled to find female software engineers. And these are some of the experiences that shaped my thoughts on workforce planning and diversity in organizations and things like this. Because I was saying, well, if it's easy for me, what am I doing differently? And the thing was that I would interview, I would work with the recruitment person for the students and say, look, if you can tell me who the female students are, I'll make sure they get an interview. I'll make sure I look after them. I'll make sure I give them feedback. I'll make sure that I can try and open as many doors as I can. So for this capability maturity, about feedback so far has been positive. You know, having a clear pathway, having a practical way to be able to do things. And I like this last one. As a stupendously privileged white male, his life has essentially gotten the easy route to success. I'd like to compliment you on this work. And that was really nice to be able to see. Because it was, like I said, it was a real struggle emotionally to be able to go through this. This has also kickstarted some other ideas. So there's a website and a Twitter account called Not the Only One, where I'm capturing, curating, and sharing stories and data about racism and intersectionality. And I really like the idea of this idea around side by side, where, you know, this is an American version. I'm not sure if you're into sports, but Tom Brady walks off the field without shaking hands, and he's a fierce competitor, hates losing, right? He's forgiven. Cam Newton walks off the field. This is both Super Bowl losses, by the way. Cam Newton walks off the field without shaking hands. He's a classless thug and he doesn't get it. He's punished. So I really like this idea of side by side because I think it really just exposes that systemic, subtle sort of racism. And I also, what I did is I set up a mentoring program called Mentoring for People of Color, aiming for senior leadership positions, where we managed to connect 4 mentees with mentors. I don't think I did a very good job of that, but due to other circumstances, but it was actually good to be able to do that. And it was good to be able to try and reach out to things. But again, that's kind of a band-aid solution, that mentoring program, because the actual change has to come from people with privilege. And all the people who are mentoring were, you know, people who did have privilege, but not as much privilege as others. So I really like to acknowledge there's a lot of people that I follow on Twitter and I've read, but I haven't captured them and I haven't done that. But I just wanted to thank them, because this is not me coming and saying this is what I've thought. This is me pulling together all the threads that people have been saying and just trying to make it easier to digest.